Welcome to Truth, Dissent, and the Legacy of Daniel Ellsberg, a 50th anniversary conference commemorating the release of the Pentagon Papers. I am Chancellor Kumble Subbaswamy, and UMass Amherst is proud to host this extraordinary gathering of historical figures and distinguished speakers. And I thank all our honored guests and the more than 2,300 people who registered for this event. This conference, inspired by the university's 2019 acquisition of Daniel Ellsberg's vast and exceptional personal papers, explores the major issues that engaged and defined his life: the Vietnam War, nuclear weapons, anti-war activism, the Pentagon Papers, Watergate, whistleblowing, and the wars of the 21st century. Over the decades, as Daniel Ellsberg took on each of these issues, he was driven to uncover the truth, and in that pursuit, he was not afraid of dissent, nor its consequences. 50 years after the Pentagon Papers were published, Daniel Ellsberg's quest is as germane as in 1971. And the university, as both a stronghold for seeking the truth and as guardian of his remarkable collection, is committed to ensuring his legacy remains broadly accessible and in the public sphere, informing our discourse for decades to come. Dan recently celebrated his 90th birthday, and we're thrilled that he joins us to offer the keynote remarks and participate in 2 panels. Thank you, Dan, for everything. Please join me as well in honoring the memory of Rob Cox, former director of our Special Collections and University Archives, who passed away last May. Rob was a compassionate polymath, dedicated to social justice and the university. And near the end of his life, he played a key role in persuading Dan Ellsberg that UMass would be the ideal repository for his papers. I also want to thank the GroundTruth Project under the leadership of Charles Sennott, journalist, writer, and a member of the class of '84, for collaborating with us on this conference, as well as its complementing podcast series, The Whistleblower, Truth, Dissent, and the Legacy of Daniel Ellsberg, now airing on GBH. Dan and Charlie also joined with our own Chris Appy, professor of history, and Kathy Roberts Ford, professor of journalism, in a year-long undergraduate seminar, providing our students with the opportunity to speak with Dan and conduct research by mining his papers. We're grateful to all of them for offering this inspiring experience. And I thank our seminar students for their commitment to seeking the truth through scholarship. Once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us in this exploration.
Thank you. Thank you, Chancellor Subbaswamy. I'm Charles Sennott. I'm the founder of the GroundTruth Project. And I also want to thank the Chancellor's office and Vice Chancellor John Kennedy, and really all of UMass, especially the History Department, for partnering with the GroundTruth Project on this year-long history project. I'm really honored to be here with all of you, at least virtually. And to just say, I'm proud this is my alma mater and my son's alma mater. Both of us are graduates of the history department, and it really feels like a true homecoming in so many ways. Most of all, I really want to highlight the amazing students. You heard them in the first panel. These students are exceptional. It's been really an honor to watch them at work under Professor Christian Appy's leadership. They have been the stars at the center of this year-long project, learning about Dan Ellsberg's history. Truth is honored at UMass. It's a place where history is understood as something that we have to think about in its current context. We have to think about how history informs the present. And I think historic convenings like this one around ideas of truth and dissent and the legacy of Daniel Ellsberg are really a hallmark of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Chris will soon be introducing Dan, but I just wanted to say what an honor it's been to work with you, Dan, for more than a year on this project. Your life journey as a truth teller is profoundly important in this moment in time when it feels like truth is so under attack, almost at every turn. You know, we've all been through just an incredibly difficult year for our country, for the planet. There's been a global pandemic, a racial reckoning, an attack on our democracy on January 6th, and a steady erosion of truth and an attempt to weaponize doubt around shared sets of facts. And so never has it been more important to ponder these two ideas, truth and dissent, and to honor those like you, Dan, who are truth tellers. We have a chance in this conference to honor your legacy, Dan, as a true American patriot, a global force for truth. And on this year, on June 13th, when we mark the 50th anniversary of the release of the Pentagon Papers, we're really honored to know that we're going to be part of telling your story from now right up till then. So I want to highlight, if I can, just for a moment, our work with you, Dan, on the podcast. The podcast is called The Whistleblower, Truth, Dissent, and the Legacy of Daniel Ellsberg. For everyone in the audience, we invite you to come and subscribe to the podcast. You can do that wherever you get your podcasts, on iTunes or Stitcher. You can get it through the conference portal, and you can get it on our website, www.thegroundtruthproject.org. Episode 1 has already launched, so you can get right into it. Today, we will be launching episode 2, and I hope it will take you through the journey of Dan's incredible narrative and really embrace his story. We hope it helps you frame this conference. We hope it might help you understand the importance of the moment and understand that Dan's history informs our present in profound ways. Thank you, and I turn it over to you now, Chris, to introduce Dan.
Thank you, Chancellor and Charlie. It's been wonderful to collaborate with you and so many others on all these projects. I want now to introduce the guest of honor, Dan Ellsberg. We've been so indebted to him this year, not just for his papers, but for his participation in all these projects, including this conference where he will appear on 3 different times. I should mention, however, that due to a recent bout with Bell's palsy, Dan would prefer to join us only via audio, not on camera. He regrets that, but we're very grateful that he's been willing to join us. And we're going to be running, I think, if we can get it up, a short slideshow of photographs of Ellsberg that a family friend named Jan Thomas was kind enough to send us. Most of you who are watching know that almost 50 years ago, in 1971, Dan Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, a 7,000-page set of documents, top secret documents and analysis about U.S. decision-making in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968, which exposed systematic war-related lying by 4 presidential administrations, both Democratic and Republican. Somewhat less recalled is the Nixon administration's massive overreaction to the Pentagon Papers and to Ellsberg. They went after the press and tried to shut it down. They charged Ellsberg eventually with 12 felony counts, some of them under the Espionage Act of 1917, by which he faced a possible 115-year sentence in prison. What is also forgotten by many people is that it wasn't enough for Nixon to try Ellsberg in the courts. It was his concern about Ellsberg that led him to form what he called the Special Investigations Unit, but which was soon dubbed the Plumbers because of course plumbers plug leaks, and Dan was the most famous leaker of his time. So this group of plumbers committed serious crimes against Ellsberg, including most famously breaking into the office of Dan's psychiatrist. And it was near the end of Ellsberg's trial and the trial of his friend and former colleague at RAND, Tony Russo, who helped him copy the Pentagon Papers. Near the end of that trial, the Watergate trials were and investigations were really heating up and exposed the series of crimes against Ellsberg. So the judge really had no choice but to throw the case out. And for the next 50 years, Ellsberg became an outspoken critic and a consistent critic of U.S. foreign and nuclear policy, a committed peace activist who's been arrested, I think, more than 75 times for acts of civil disobedience. So it's a great honor to have him join us at this conference. So I will turn it over to you, Dan, right now.
I want to thank Chancellor Subbaswamy. It's not just pro forma as the Chancellor of the University, but I know that you were critical in your enthusiasm for getting this archive in the first place. So I really thank you for that, along with the late Robert Cox, who was head of the archive, wanted Robert Poland, my friend now at Perry at UMass, who also saw the possibilities here. And Chris, I know in your class, I was very impressed by those young people. It's inspiring to me to see the lessons that they drew, which I must say are exactly what I wished, exactly in terms of how one can address being an American citizen today now and how to deal with that. It's especially wonderful to see this lineup of contributors that you've gotten together, participants, Chris. So many of them are long-term associates of mine, friends. Some of them really have changed my life, and I love them for it. Randy Keeler, you'll hear from, without whose example of going to prison to protest the war, I wouldn't have risked prison myself. Mort Halperin, who actually, without whose information about Nixon's policy, I wouldn't have thought of risking prison. And he's a long-term associate then, and his work on the trial absolutely key in keeping me out of prison. So I can think he's one of those on the defense team, the whole team, who are responsible that I'm not in prison right now, potentially, having served half of my possible term. Or more likely, let's say, if I had good behavior, 35 years of it. So it's a wonderful day to address all these. You're not seeing my lips move as I talk to you because they can't. That's the nature of Bell's palsy, basically. I found that General Curtis LeMay suffered from Bell's palsy, which is why he always had a cigar in his mouth in all his pictures to hide the palsy. And I thought of coming on with a cigar, but that's not an association I really I want to encourage. But I can assure you it's temporary, whether it's months or even a year. It's not painful, except when I look in the mirror. And then I see back Dick Cheney. And that's a cruel joke in a way. Why karma has a mean sense of humor. But for now, let's just go, and I look forward to your questions, Charlie and Chris.
Thanks so much, Dan. Let me start by asking you, why do you think Nixon took such extreme measures against you? Or to put it differently, why do you think he apparently agreed with his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, who described you to him as the most dangerous man in America?
Well, I've long known the answer to that question, Chris, which, by the way, I can't remember ever having been asked in 50 years, strangely enough, because without those actions that he took against me, I believe he would have stayed in office and the war would have continued. So it's a very critical question, and most people imagine, without knowing an answer, that he was simply impulsive, paranoid, off the wall, irrational. I think that's not the case. That he had, in his mind, reasonable grounds for the action that he took, and that really many other presidents would have done much the same in the same circumstances. The reason is that I was a danger to his policy. Egil Krogh, chief of the plumbers against me, said to his judge when he was being sentenced that he saw the freedom of the president to pursue his chosen foreign policy was the essence of national security. And that's an interesting definition, actually, which I think is widely shared. And we can come back to that critically. I did threaten his freedom of action because Nixon, contrary to many historical accounts and the public at large, did have a secret plan, in effect to win the war or to end the war acceptably. And it had to be secret from the American people, not from Hanoi, which he was threatening explicitly, more or less telling his plan and his demands. And both the threats and the demands had to be secret from the American people, because they would have been seen as crazy or reckless or too dangerous, too costly, and he wouldn't have been allowed really to pursue them. So he knew that I knew. I had an understanding of a secret plan. I told it to Kissinger, actually, a year before the papers came out at San Clemente, my understanding what the plan was. And he also knew that I had critically copied documents separate from the Pentagon Papers, different from the Pentagon Papers, that showed what his plan was. That hinted at what his plan was, but he didn't know how much I had. He had reason to believe that the people who had left the National Security Council, 5 of them, in protest over Cambodia, did know his plan, specifically the nuclear threats that he was making, which were critical to his plan. Roger Morris, one of his main aides, deputies to Henry Kissinger, had seen the target folders for nuclear weapons in North Vietnam in the fall of 1969, before he left. And as Roger told me later, we should have thrown open the safe and screamed bloody murder, because that's exactly what it was. But they hadn't done that, unfortunately. Roger said that was the greatest regret and shame of his life. But they could have. And Nixon did have a reasonable fear that I would come out and expose what he was trying to do, and we'll maybe get to that. But in order to shut me up then, they went into my former psychiatrist's office, CIA assets, to find material, not, as public generally think, to defame me. I was already on trial, facing 12 felony counts. That's something of a stigma. But in order to threaten me, to blackmail me with revealing these, if I actually did reveal what I might have to reveal his policy. And then later, when they didn't find what they needed for that, efforts to incapacitate me totally, to attack me on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd, 1972, and to overhear me on Mort Halpern's phone, as it happens, and others, without a warrant, a warrantless wiretap. All of these things being in those days illegal, actually they've been in effect legalized since 9/11, and he wouldn't have the need to lie about them and obstruct justice to hide them nowadays. But at that time, he was threatened with facing indictment for criminal actions or impeachment before that. And when finally, toward the end of my trial, thanks to John Dean, who's going to be with us today, speaking out about what had been done, and thanks to Alex Butterfield, who revealed the taping, thanks to people who resigned rather than fire the special prosecutor, that information came out, which was unlikely to have done so without these initiatives by these other people. And as a result of that, he faced impeachment and had to resign. That made the war endable.
Dan, this is Charlie, and I just wanted to follow up on Chris's question and dig in even a little deeper on Nixon and on his campaign promises in 1968, where he was saying consistently that he would bring peace with honor. Not exactly sure what he meant by that, but that he would bring peace with honor in Vietnam. And of course, the Pentagon Papers land in 1971, and they really contribute to this intensifying resistance to the war. But the war goes on, and it goes on until 1975. And so, two-part question, really. Why do you think the war did go on so long? Would it have gone on longer, as it did with Afghanistan? And how would you frame the historical comparison between the U.S.-led wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan, and lessons learned and perhaps not learned from history? So this is it, Dan. I'll go over it again.
Again, very important. I think oddly, over the 50 years, very few people have asked the question, what took so long to end the war? What were they negotiating about? They don't ask the question and they don't find it. There are historians like Larry Berman who really have probed into this and have the answers, but they're not widely known. He never defined what he meant by peace with honor, and I think people thought they meant getting out under some fig leaf of some sort, some excuse, as quickly as possible, and accepting that Saigon, that there would be unification of all of Vietnam, North and South, in one country, quickly under communist control, and that Saigon and the other cities would come under communist control at best after a decent interval, which might be 6 months, a year and a half after the U.S. troops got out. And I think, by the way, Hubert Humphrey might well have done something like that had he been in. Nixon had no intention of that. For him, peace meant an absence of U.S. ground army conflict. Basically, he thought the American people would accept that as the end of the war, because it was the end of the American ground war and casualties. And by the way, he was pretty shrewd on that, I'm sorry to say. But his plan then was to get the American troops out, hopefully, he really did hope, in his first year, a quick end. But if at worst, by the end of his first term or the start of the second, and that Saigon and the other major cities would remain under the control of our anointed puppet, essentially, General Nguyen Van Thieu, until the end of his second term. That would be in early 1977. So he was looking at American troops being gone, but Thieu, our anti-communist, basically American-controlled puppet, would remain in power without the American troops for 8 years, not for a year and a half. I think almost nobody in the public imagined that he could achieve such a thing or even would think of it. The heart of his plan was to bring that about, which might have seemed almost impossible, by assuring that as American troops left, North Vietnamese troops from the northern part of the country, regular troops, would leave South Vietnam and go back to the north. So that Thieu would be confronting only the NLF, the guerrilla forces, the more southern forces, with the help of an enlarged Army of Republic of Vietnam, ARVN they called it, our troops, paid for, managed, trained pretty much along our principles. Everything they carried, their arms, their boots, their helmets, all from the United States, they would be enlarged, and they would be supported by American air support, which he did not foresee removing at all. The war, in other words, would go on in the air as far as the U.S. concerned, but he counted on the American public essentially accepting that. To jump right away to the end of your question, it's pretty much what we have in Afghanistan right now and have had for almost 20 years. That's what Nixon was aiming at, a war where the U.S. participation, we would keep in the capital and major cities a U.S.-dominated government with the help of U.S. air and local troops. So how was he going to get the North Vietnamese troops out? And the answer was by threatening them with nuclear weapons that if they did not leave mutually at the same time as Americans, he would annihilate North Vietnam. And he had plans for doing that as early as 1969 and early on. So he'd gotten that idea from when he was vice president under President Eisenhower and saw what Nixon regarded and Eisenhower regarded as successful nuclear threats in the Taiwan Straits in 54, 55, and in 58, in Korea even earlier, in Iraq, Kuwait, at various times. So he felt, okay, these nuclear threats do the job, and if necessary, you carry them out. But hopefully, he said, Ho Chi Minh will be in Paris to sue for peace as soon as he hears these threats, which was wrong. And I was sure, I knew that from Mort Halperin, that this was basically, who was still working for Kissinger in '69, and who was, and basically I understood from having been in Vietnam for 2 years, having studied the Pentagon Papers, very crucially, the history of it, I was sure these threats would not succeed in getting the Northern troops out, or in keeping Thieu in power. So I saw this then as a plan for extending the war indefinitely, not what Nixon expected or wanted, but that's what would happen, and enlarging it, very possibly to a point where, with our attacks on North Vietnam, the Chinese would come in and we'd have another Korea, essentially. So that was the, now, your question is, why did the war go on? Well, my expectations and Mort's expectations were fulfilled. They didn't meet those terms. They never did take the Northern troops out. The war became endable only after 3 years later, when finally Nixon and Kissinger dropped their demand that the Northern troops get out. And that was again accompanied, most people saw that when we got our troops out, that was essentially conceding Vietnam to the North, to Hanoi. But the events of 1972, the offensive there and the heavy bombing of North Vietnam and later of Hanoi, showed that their basic concept that American air power could, in fact, hold off the North Vietnamese troops and the NLF long enough, well, to keep Thieu in power, that plan was feasible. In the end, it cost 20,000 American more lives to get there, and an uncounted number of Vietnamese, 500,000 or 1 million, that was acceptable to them. A key point here, finally, that we didn't fully appreciate until relatively recently, was that the sticking point in the negotiations that kept any agreement from being held year after year after year was Nixon's strange, determined demand that Thieu, specifically Thieu, must not leave the government and must remain in power. And Hanoi absolutely would not accept that until after the offensive and the bombing in '72, when the Soviets and the Chinese both pressed them to accept that for the time being. But they were strongly against that. Why was Nixon so adamant on that, which the public didn't know at all, I would say, and even historians for quite a while didn't know. It's only a couple of years ago that John Farrell finally came up with the proof from Haldeman's diary that had not previously been released, that Nixon himself had run the operation that was known to occur earlier in October and November of 1968, when Nixon, through other intermediaries and through the Vietnamese ambassador in Washington, Boisium, and via Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Madame Chennault, not Chiang Kai-shek, Madame Chennault, had assured Thieu that he would get a better deal from Nixon than from Humphrey, which, by the way, was not only sincere on Nixon's part, it was true. In fact, Thieu did get a better deal than he would have gotten from Humphrey. Thieu outlived Nixon in office, which, again, Nixon's leaving was not foreseeable. But had Nixon remained in office, I believe Thieu would have too, and the war would have gone on with American air support. But in the course of these negotiations, which were known to the FBI through taps of Boisium and others, Nixon always believed that his own plane had been tapped. That's not been shown. But in any case, Johnson knew of these negotiations and with Nixon, which were intended to keep Thieu from going to Paris in negotiations. Now, the prospect of those negotiations had brought Humphrey up from way behind, up to being even with Nixon at the very end of the campaign. And In fact, in one poll, he was even ahead of him. And in a matter of days, probably, he would have surpassed and won that election, which in the end depended on only 500,000 votes. But Humphrey's rise stopped abruptly when Thieu refused to go to Paris and take part in these negotiations. So as Thieu said to my friend, his former friend, his friend at that time, Tran Yuk Chau, a fellow officer in Vietnam, I elected Nixon. And he had. And Nixon knew that. And Nixon also knew that Thieu could reveal that at any time. What we had here was that Nixon had done what Donald J. Trump was accused of doing with the Russians in 2016, collusion with a foreign power by a Republican opposition, a Republican rival for the presidency, in order to win an election. And that was not proved on Donald J. Trump, thanks to his stonewalling, perhaps, and perhaps because it didn't happen, who knows, but he was charged with it. It did happen under Nixon, and that was an impeachable offense at any time. So this hidden, adamant demand that Thieu must remain in power, which kept the war going year after year, 20,000 more American dead, I say 500,000 Vietnamese, I believe was strongly based on the fact that he could not afford to have Thieu release his recordings of those communications, including communications from Bui Diem and Thieu, which undoubtedly existed, that would have shown that Nixon had corruptly won that office. And the effect was that he virtually did succeed in his plan, except that his maneuvers in order to keep it secret, the crimes against me, did become public thanks to John Dean and thanks to the other people in this chain of events that led to a very unusual, a remarkable instance that the crimes of a president were revealed while he was still in office and running for office.
That's great, Dan. I'd like to ask a question about the Pentagon Papers, and maybe you can try to keep the answer pretty brief because we leave room at the end for you to be able to address a final question or whatever you want to talk about. I have a question about the Pentagon Papers. What has been learned from them, or what might have been learned from the Pentagon Papers that's relevant to our own time?
Well, I was rather amazed to read, and it's in my book, Secrets Are Reproduced, but it's often reproduced, that on the second day of the Pentagon Papers, just 2 episodes had appeared in the New York Times. There was to be 3 before the injunction stopped them. And it started on Sunday, the 13th, and on Monday, the 14th, after just 2, H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff, reported to Nixon on a staff meeting that had in which Donald Rumsfeld, later Secretary of Defense, but at that time part of the White House staff, had spoken on the import, what is to be learned from the papers. And he said, to the ordinary guy, this is a bunch of gobbledygook. But out of the gobbledygook comes a very clear thing. You can't trust the government. You can't believe what they say, and you can't rely on their judgment. And the implicit infallibility of presidents, which has been an accepted thing in America, is badly hurt by this, because it shows that people do things the president wants to do, even though it's wrong. And the president can be wrong. Okay, when I read that, I thought, wow, smart guy. Rumsfeld was never accused of being dumb. His judgment in getting us into Iraq, came into question later. I thought, okay, if he learned those lessons, if those are the lessons which are absolutely right, and if he's right that the public can see this in the papers, and I think that was largely true, how could he have done what he did later in Iraq and Afghanistan? And I think the answer is that he learned from those 23 years of history, the president can get away with it. This is what happens, and it doesn't come out except it's under extraordinary conditions. This one did come out. And yes, the president can do wrong, I'll come back to that, and people will carry it out for him, and they will keep the secret. The secret had been very well kept for that time, as has been true we don't have the Pentagon Papers of Iraq or Afghanistan, and certainly we got into those on the basis of as much lying and delusion and mistake by ignorance by the public as was true in Vietnam years earlier. And in other words, the public hadn't learned how to avoid that kind of trap. And I think one reason for that was where even Rumsfeld was wrong. He said, people have learned that presidents do this. Unfortunately, what the Pentagon Papers showed them was that past presidents did this. Now, my whole hope was I didn't have the documents that Nixon feared I had, but I did have it orally from not only from Halpern but from John Vann and some others, but I couldn't prove it. Just as when John Dean came out, he didn't have at that time the documents until the tapes came out later. So what people learned, what I think Nixon went on was a better assumption. They won't assume that's true of the present president, even if it was true, as I was pointing out, of 4 past presidents in a row. I was saying they all lied. These were their aims. They were pursuing this stalemate, basically, in order not to give up part of the empire and to be accused of being an incompetent manager of empire. Not that word would have been used, but that was the idea. People give so much the benefit of the doubt to the president. They're so willing to believe what he says, even if they didn't vote for him, that he really could continue to get away with it. And the result was that lesson that I hoped would come out from the papers, that a 5th president in a row was doing what the others had done. It didn't seem so obscure. It didn't get through at all. The papers did not ask the question, what is Nixon doing in contrast to what he's saying? What's the prospect of this? What's going on? That didn't come out, and to this day really hasn't. So things that the government learned that try to get rid of the draft. Ground troops, do without ground troops. The Nixon Doctrine was announced in mid-'69, and here's a point that I've almost never heard anyone else make. I didn't understand it at the time. He said, this is the Nixon Doctrine, our policy is going to be to provide air power and let the ground troops come from the local people that we're supporting and defending. Well, we had 500,000 troops at that time in Vietnam, so everybody thought, including me, he's talking about the future. That's what he wants to get to. The truth was that was his plan for Vietnam. Get the troops out, get the northern troops out, which he didn't get, but it turned out that with the air power, he could compensate for them. We did beat back the offensive in 72 with minimal involvement of our troops. It was mainly B-52s and fighter bombers and whatnot did manage to do it. And that's, of course, what we are doing in Afghanistan. And we've done it for 20 years. So going back to Charlie's question, if I may, when he said, why did the war go on so long? Because it could. At that point, it was going to go on much longer. I forget if part of your question or not, Charlie. I think the war was fated, except for an extraordinary set of circumstances, to go on much longer than it did. Nixon was going to bring back the air. He had actually ordered doing that by mid-April, as soon as our troops were out. But he had to rescind that order when John Dean's information about the break-in to my psychiatrist's office and then the attempt, I didn't mention this earlier, to incapacitate me physically, totally, on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd. When that came out, and when that was then verified by tapes and by other documents, by testimony that came out, all of those things had to happen to make something absolutely amazing happen, and that was to keep Nixon from renewing the air power. Had he done so, now here there will be controversy. There are those who say without the American troops, the war would have been over shortly anyway. I don't believe that. And my friend John Vann definitely did not believe that. In fact, I was just thinking how Nixon, if we asked how he could have done it differently, John Vann was the probably most knowledgeable man, former military than aide, had said in early '69, when he was over there, you should get American troops, remove 100,000 right away, and a couple 100,000 within the year, and get down to 100,000 or 40,000 or something like that, because air power will do this. We'll hold on to what you have. And Nixon could have avoided, I think, 3 years of heavy escalation, and he could have avoided the interventions he made into Laos and Cambodia, which were intended to convince Hanoi that he would carry out ultimately his threats of escalation. He would go beyond what Lyndon Johnson had ever done, and therefore they should give in. They weren't needed. They didn't affect. They didn't get what he wanted, but they weren't needed. So I'm saying we've learned from Afghanistan what the American people will put up with in the way of bombing other people without American casualties. That's a sad lesson for me and dismaying, and we have to come to terms with it somehow. Charlie Goodell, who lost office in November '70 as a Republican from New York because he opposed the war, and later was a member of my defense team, said to me while he was still in the Senate in December '70, before the Pentagon Papers came out, Dan, the American people don't care about Vietnamese casualties, which I was talking to him about. So they just don't care. They care about American casualties, and they're not going to care. And I remember saying to him at the time, you might be right, Charlie. I hope you're not right, because he's going to get the American casualties down, and he's going to get the troops down, not the Vietnamese casualties down, and the war could go on indefinitely. Well, I'm afraid Charlie was pretty much right. In fact, I've been thinking about the recent trial of Chauvin and the charge against him, of which he was convicted, depraved indifference, carrying on lethal activities or potentially lethal activities with with an evidence of an unconcern for the risks that you're carrying. It's a form of murder. They call it depraved heart, depraved mind, depraved indifference murder. And really, I don't think Americans are unusual in this respect. I think they're human, but their concern for the people we were killing in the process of controlling these areas is imperceptible, and that has to change. If it doesn't change, I think we won't escape the consequences of our own policies of the last 70 years in the nuclear era.
Thanks, Dan. That is a very powerful history and brings us to the moment. And I wanted to ask a question about this year-long history project. We've been focusing in on the themes of truth and dissent. So we built all of the work around that, the seminar, the podcast, the website. How do you evaluate the status of those two terms in our own moment when it feels like truth is really being eroded, and it feels too often like dissent is being muted? What lessons about truth and dissent can we learn from your life, and what might they offer for some inspiration today?
Well, a truth, of course, that I learned in Vietnam, along with nearly all of the 3 million people we sent to Vietnam, was that what we were doing had no prospect of success, that there was no progress being made, that was a lie being told to the public. There was no end in sight in terms of what we were doing, and it wasn't going to get better. I had been in the Pentagon, and a year before that, for the 2 years in Vietnam, and I was prepared to say, more bombing isn't going to do it. I was there during the bombing escalation. More troops are not going to do it. In other words, we're not going to change what we're doing ineffectively. And that's why I came to think that it was essential to do something to change it. But the other truth, and let me mention one broad truth that I didn't get right away until after the trial. I continued to think of Vietnam as kind of an aberration in our policy. And as I think very many Americans did and still do. And that it was something that should be ended, but it was a mistake. We'd planted a flag in the wrong place here for whatever reason. And that it didn't characterize American policy generally. That was wrong. It was only after the trial that I had time to read the so-called revisionist historians, like the one that just died, Walter Lefebvre, and a number of others, Gar Alperovitz, that my wife Patricia says should better be called historians rather than revisionists, but actually based on history, showing that Vietnam was absolutely in the pattern of what we do, especially in the former colonial areas, which we more or less took over. I thought for a very long time, I've understood that everybody knows we took over the French colonial project in Vietnam in a way that surprised even the French. How could they do that? They'd failed that and so forth. That's what we've done pretty much everywhere in the former colonial areas. Take over the, quote, responsibilities and obligations and supposed rights of regime change and determining who runs, who governs, who rules in these so-called third world areas or more underdeveloped areas, mostly former colonial, and use them for resources, investment, cheap labor, and so forth. In short, it took me after the war to really realize that I had been part of what I would now call a covert empire. This is one of the truths I think that America has yet to learn, and it can't do it too soon. It should be right away. By that term, which I was led to, I mean this. Covert implies plausibly denied. It means you not only lie, you not only conceal what you're doing, that's clandestine, in part secret, but it means you especially conceal who is the sponsor of these acts and what purposes, what are being done. You provide false or misleading evidence for what you're saying and plausible cover stories about who's doing what. Especially plausible to people who want to believe what you're saying, because they don't want to believe. Americans don't want to believe we are an empire in the sense that we have an illegitimate influence, determination on who governs other nations, other people, as we do. The term regime change has become actually commonplace now, and yet it's the very definition of empire. We decide who governs someone else, and we do it with means that have to be denied too. Assassinations, coups, military dictatorships, paramilitary operations, bribes, and so forth, as well as cultural influence that's more open. So the truth, then, is that we are an empire. We who think of ourselves as born in an anti-imperial project, the first war of national liberation, we have always really been an empire, especially addressed to the continental U.S., but then beyond that. And Central America is very much, we've hardly disguised that is, quote, our sphere of influence. But when you look as far afield as Indonesia, not only the Philippines, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and of course Vietnam, and now the Middle East. So what do we do about that? Well, the problem is that involves us in subduing resistance to our distant influence, our control. And it involves acts like, as I said, torture, detention, mass killing, depraved indifference, murder. A key thing then that I came to when you ask about truth is that to realize when I read the earliest parts of the Pentagon Papers, which revealed the Imperial Project, or the fact that we'd taken over from the French. We accepted the Imperial Project of the French and replaced them. I came to see then that our effort had no legitimacy at all from the beginning, no justification for the killing we were doing. So it was unjustified homicide, and that involved all the people, the military on their side as well as on our side, the civilians on both sides. All of them, I think, were subject to unjustified homicide as a result of U.S. policy. And to me, that meant murder. And I didn't have a word for it then. We had just gotten in the Chauvin case, depraved indifference murder, depraved murder, of which he was just found guilty. Unconcern. The Pentagon Papers show clearly an absolute lack of concern for what we were doing to Vietnam, to the society, to the people, and whatnot. Just isn't in there. It just isn't. This is the cost, and it's worth it for this reason. No, it's just not there. And that I knew at the time. So we have to face, then, this question keeps coming up of, who are we? We aren't, it's not American to torture. Well, it turns out we've learned from Vietnam, from Middle East, in a report that remains classified, 6,000 pages for the Senate Intelligence Committee, details of our torture and the fact that it did zero good. Now that you couldn't predict entirely, but that's the way it comes out. Maybe that's why it is still totally classified. That's not us. Well, actually, that is us. And, we are for self-determination. We are for democracy everywhere, including the third world. Actually not. That's not the truth. We are not supporters of democracy in the former third world, the underdeveloped world, any more than they were under their colonial rulers. And it doesn't serve our corporate interests, our national interests, our interests for base democracy. So we overthrow it very regularly, as in Chile, Indonesia, and other places. Iran, under Mossadegh, Guatemala. And these are harsh truths. So what does one do about them? And that was the other thing that, as I said, Randy Keeler revealed to me as one of those influenced, as I came to be, by Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who in turn was influenced by Gandhi and Thoreau and Tolstoy. And namely, that when you're confronting, there are wrongs and evils that demand opposition, and they demand opposition at personal self-sacrifice, if necessary, and it usually is necessary. You can almost define a kind of extreme evil or wrong, wickedness, as something for which you should not participate in and should expose and resist, but in their view, non-violently, recognizing that these people, even though they're doing wrong and you oppose them, have human rights, have rights to life, are humans like ourselves, and that the non-violent withdrawal of deference and withdrawal of support is very powerful, and that nothing less than that is adequate and is appropriate. So these people put that thought in my mind. Without that, I would not have thought of giving the Pentagon Papers. It's, of course, we'll see later. I recognize that entirely in the actions of Chelsea Manning and of Edward Snowden. We'll see later on this. Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead.
I just was going to give you an opportunity. We only have maybe 3 minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
I know you can be more of an optimist than what you just said. I'm wondering, what gives
I haven't actually said
I know
what the chances are, but I have said what has to change. I think anybody can recognize that as very difficult and not very likely.
Give us a few words of hope here at the end.
Yes. things are uncertain. Humans are uncertain. While there's life, there's hope, supposedly. My friend Joanna Macy puts it, hope is not a feeling or an expectation. It's a way of acting. And I chose to act in the reality as if there were a chance for humans to develop this kind of concern for the lives of others. As humans, we are subject, not just as Americans, but as humans, I think we're subject very fundamentally to dichotomize the rest of humanity, us and them, we and others. And there are widening circles of others. But in the end, you get to a point where, I'm sorry to say, the truth is, people have essentially no concern at all for those others that are far enough out. And that can be defined by our leaders very quickly. I think we have to develop a species identity and concern and loyalty that is not normally human. We haven't seen it up till now in the millennia of civilization. And so is it possible? Well, we don't know. We haven't seen it. We now affect with climate and the fossil fuels and the nuclear possibilities we'll be talking about, we can affect almost all of humanity. That wasn't true before. It wasn't something we had to worry about. I think we have to find a kind of concern for us in ourselves, and I think that's possible. It's almost a miracle to change that much as fast as it needs to change, but we have seen miracles like that. In 83 or 84, the idea of the Berlin Wall coming down and Warsaw Pact dissolving and Soviet Union, USSR dissolving was not unlikely. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. But it did happen. For Nelson Mandela to come to power in South Africa without a violent revolution was impossible. And it did happen. And I'll say one that that I and Patricia are very aware of, that most people weren't. The chance that didn't go to prison was impossible. We didn't see that at the time. We thought it was unlikely. But when we learned that the judge had from the beginning been considered to be bribed, to be head of the FBI, if my trial came out right, meant that I had no chance. It was impossible. That wasn't obvious to us, but what did seem, until we learned that, but it did seem that I believed, and rightly so, the war would not end while Nixon was in office. He was going to continue it in the air. So when the troops came out and everybody celebrated the end of the war, it's peace, so forth, Hughes there, peace with honor. No, it's war with Hugh still in power. And that was true, say, in January of 1973, just as I was about to go to trial for the second time. Basically, there was a suspension. The chance that Nixon would be out after the landslide of 72 in November, an unprecedented landslide, the chance that Nixon would be out of office and thus the war would be endable was zero. There was no way that was going to happen. And yet, by the actions of a lot of different people in which our acts were one link in a chain of actions, none of which could be expected. Dean was not expected to take on the president the way he did. Alex Butterfield was not expected at all, zero, to reveal the taping in the office. Elliot Richardson was not expected to refuse to fire the special prosecutor or Rutherford. That's how Elliot Richardson had gotten to that post, one after another, of doing what the president demanded. And with all of those things, it did come about. And the war was able to be ended in 75, without which not. So, in short, I choose to act as if it's possible that we can come to a concern, a sufficient concern for humanity at large and of our own responsibility as Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden faced and I faced, the perception this truth is necessary to come out and others are not going to do it. That was the truth. Therefore, I must do it. in that last attack, people can tell the truth, and they can risk their jobs, which is critical. They can risk their reputations and their careers. Very unlikely. Not normally human, but not impossible for humans. And it even occurred to me, if we just come to realize when it's a matter of us and others' lives matter. The lives of others matter. Simple motto, which is very familiar to us right now. It occurred to me last night. When people say Black Lives Matter, and everybody says, well, of course, all lives matter, etc. Not really true. What that slogan is saying, the police we support, often act as if they didn't matter. And we act in Afghanistan, we act in Iraq, we act in these other places as if those lives didn't matter, and we can change that because they do matter.
Dan, thank you so much. That's really such a good place to stop. You've been wonderful. I want to thank viewers and just remind them that Dan will be back with us at 1 o'clock on a panel on nuclear weapons and why they still, what to do about them. That'll be moderated by Zia Mian, and it'll feature Dan Ellsberg, Fred Kaplan, and Beatrice Fenn. Want also to remind viewers to tune in to the GroundTruth Project the Whistleblower podcast, 2 of which are already out. So thanks very much, Dan, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for those questions. Very good. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Dan.